Hello, everyone. Welcome to our weekly chat here. I'm just trying to figure out a way to post a photo. I'll do that later. That's going to be part of our discussion today. But again, thanks for joining us, whether you're live or watching later. I know a lot of people watch later, which is fantastic because I get the feedback from that. And your comments and your messages that you send privately, which most people are doing. I get a few of those. So thanks for the topic ideas, and I'm glad this is working out and we're getting more and more listeners and watchers each week. So that's fantastic. One of the things that was confusing, just a little housekeeping as we begin, there were some people confused about how to watch it. I know I share this on my personal page and also on some of the Easter or history pages. This is the page to watch it on. So it's the my professional page with my portrait, Robert Lowell Goller, and then the portrait of me. So if you're not getting the messages or the notifications, it may be because you haven't liked or followed this professional page. You might be my friend on the personal Facebook profile. But this is the page to follow. And even though it's shared on other pages, and I thank people for doing that, or if I've shared it, it's not popping up on those pages. So it's just this page. So like and follow this page, Robert Lowell Goller, the one you're watching on right now. And if you do that, you'll get the notifications. So there are a couple people concerned they weren't getting the notifications, and then I looked and saw they weren't following the page. So you could please do that, and that helps support me and the page and what we're doing here. So I appreciate that very, very, very much. Also, feel free to share if you have a video that you like. It's shareable, so feel free to share it out there. I don't mind that at all. The more people who are watching and getting in on the discussion, the better. So share or follow the page, like the page. That's great. So today I wanted to talk about, and this is yet another idea I got from reading the newspaper. I had been reading some, the New York Times I read a lot, and I also read a lot of other publications. And there was an article recently, and there's been a couple actually, about the trouble with myths in history. And this is on a national level. Or an international level, and how it's important to make sure that when we are making arguments about present day politics, that we make sure we have our history right. Because not only do we look foolish if we don't have the history correct, it leads to a bad debate. And we've seen this happen a number of times. And there's just two examples I want to point out, and it's been pointed out to me numerous times, and I've been a part of debates where these things have come up. And it really causes problems when we're debating issues today. And one of those, and I'll just, there's lots of them out there, but these are the two that were discussed recently, is when there was a discussion about social issues today, and someone was making the argument, several movements are making the argument that this is a Christian nation. The United States is a Christian nation, and the founding fathers founded this country on Christian principles, and they wanted this to be a Christian nation. But if you go, and then they point out, the folks who make this argument point out that the Pledge of Allegiance has one nation under God, and that actually our official United States motto is "In God We Trust," printed on our money. It's actually above the House of Representatives. The problem with that argument, and saying that those two things show that the founding fathers wanted a Christian nation, is that those mottos and that motto and that addition to the Pledge of Allegiance didn't come around until the 1950s. And it was actually during the time of the Red Scare, and they added "under God," one nation under God, to the Pledge of Allegiance then, and enacted an official motto. We didn't have one technically before, of "In God We Trust," in the 1950s. So the founding fathers had nothing to do with that. And actually, our original motto, which was it was really de facto motto, it wasn't an official motto, was "E pluribus unum," out of many one. You can make the argument that this is a Christian nation if you want, but you can't go back to the founding fathers on that, because that just doesn't hold up. So that's one of the myths that they were talking about. And the second one is A lot of times we talk about the President Lincoln signing the Emancipation Proclamation, and a lot of times we hear people say, well, that freed the enslaved people. Slaves were free after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, and that's not true. The 13th Amendment did that. The Emancipation Proclamation actually only freed enslaved people in the Confederacy outside the United States, and it was an executive order, essentially, wartime executive order that President Lincoln signed, exerting power over the Confederacy. He did not have the power to end slavery in the United States because it was in the Constitution, believe it or not. That slavery was in the Constitution, and so the only way to eliminate slavery in the United States was to have a constitutional amendment, which is what happened, the 13th Amendment. And if you watch the movie Lincoln with Daniel Day-Lewis, they go through that process, not the Emancipation Proclamation, but the process of enacting, adopting, ratifying the 13th Amendment, which was what made slavery no longer legal in the United States. So when we hear about the Emancipation Proclamation freeing slaves, that's not true. So these are just two things that people talk about, that's part of our history that's really important to understand, because if we just say the Emancipation Proclamation freed all the slaves, we misunderstand the effort, the long debate, the long persuasion that went on in Congress in order to and the states to ratify the 13th Amendment. And it wasn't as easy as just signing the Emancipation Proclamation. So to understand that and understand the debate and the states that were against it and things like that, to understand that it wasn't as easy as it sounds when you say that the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves. So that's just one of the reasons why it's important to understand actual, facts and not myths about American history. So that got me thinking about all the things that I've come across, and a lot of you may have come across in the history of East Aurora, and even any small town where you're like, well, things get repeated over and over, and they get repeated so much that they've become true. And in some cases, some of these historical facts end up in local history publications and books, even though when you look back at the real story, you can't find any validation. And in fact, sometimes we find the opposite. We find documentation and source material that disproves the myth. So not only is it left up in the air in some cases where we can't find anything to prove the story, in many cases we find a story that actually disproves the story. So and there are several examples, and I'm just going to throw about a couple of them out there. And if there's something that interests you even more, let me know. We might be able to make it a topic for a later week when we have a chat. Or I love to write articles, so I may write a little bit more about some of these if some of them are a little more intriguing for you. Speaking of the end of slavery in the United States, and I talked about this several weeks ago, and I've actually, I think in one of the earliest the weekly chats that we did on the Underground Railroad. And one of the most probably locally famous stories that I like to put in the myth category is the tunnel that allegedly existed under East Main Street in East Aurora here. And the story is that the tunnel went from one side of Main Street to another, from one house, the basement of one house on the south side of Main Street, to the basement of another house on the north side of Main Street. And it's been carefully repeated, I'll add. People don't come out and say that it was actually true, that there was this tunnel that went under Main Street. But the story's been repeated over and over again. It's one of the most, the topics I get asked about the most. And as wonderful as the story is to the local lore, it's just not true. And I used to say I don't think it's true, but I will, I sit here saying that there is no evidence that tunnel existed. And if you want to know more about that of that tunnel under Main Street and why I think it doesn't exist, you can go back into the videos here and look at the Underground Railroad chat we had a couple months ago. It just doesn't. There's no evidence for this tunnel, and it just doesn't make sense. And in fact, I felt a little validated when researching this to find that national historians who have studied abolition and the Underground Railroad way more than I have said that this idea of tunnels, the Underground Railroad just didn't work that way. So the tunnels and hiding places, it just doesn't make sense. So if you hear of tunnels in your local community, be very skeptical of it. And that's just part of our local lore that keeps getting repeated over and over again. And every time someone asks about it, I just show them the article I wrote about it and the discussion that we had a couple months ago. A tunnel for runaway enslaved folks did not exist under East Main Street, but it's become part of our local lore. Another one that I heard years ago when they were discussing an old barn that was set to be, I don't know if it was set to be torn down or there was discussion about this barn, and someone had said in a public meeting, they said, well, that barn was used for folks in East Aurora during the War of 1812. They went on the roof of the barn and watched the burning of Buffalo during the War of 1812. And I thought, oh, that's an interesting story. Well, even if the barn was old enough to go back to the War of 1812, and we weren't sure about that as I did more investigating of it, folks did not watch the burning of Buffalo from East Aurora. And you say, well, if they were up on the hill, you can see Buffalo today. Yes, you can. But, and I've conferred with other historians about this because I was just a little skeptical about my own opinion about it, but it didn't seem to make sense to me. Buffalo wasn't the big city that it was today, structurally wise. We have a lot of big buildings. So if Buffalo were to burn today, if the British were to come into Buffalo, not that they would, and burn Buffalo down, we might be able to see it from here, up on Chestnut Ridge, the ridge out in the town, maybe even from the roof of a barn here in the village. But if you had a clear view into Buffalo. And this is December, by the way. So December of 1813 when Buffalo burned. And it just didn't make sense. And Buffalo was a small village at that point. There were small houses everywhere. So to see Buffalo burning, perhaps they did, but it wasn't this big inferno that everybody, that it sounds like. They burned the city down. Well, today a city burning would be big, the giant Chicago fire in the late 1800s. But in the early 1800s, when the settlers, Buffalo was a very small little village, it wouldn't have drawn the attention, and I don't think people would have been sitting on a roof watching from afar. And it would have taken a while for folks to come from the city. They escaped the city and came to points east and south. We believe in East Aurora, people did come from the city. But the idea that people were sitting on the roofs of barns here in East Aurora watching the burning of Buffalo during the War of 1812, it just doesn't make sense. So that's a story that's been put out there, that people from East Aurora were watching the city burning during War of 1812. And it just doesn't hold up, because it would have been a series of small house fires, essentially. And it wouldn't have been, it's not like large skyscrapers were burning down and they would have been seen from far away. So that is one of those myths. I'd be glad to be proven wrong on that, and I would welcome the discussion, but I don't think that's true. And I've had a discussion with other people about it just to bounce the idea off other historians to see. Another fun one a fun story that had been out there for years. I was a volunteer docent at the Millard Fillmore presidential site, his honeymoon cottage, which is here on Shear Avenue in East Aurora, operated by the Aurora Historical Society. And as historian, I work closely with the Historical Society, and for when I was able to volunteer there for a couple years as a docent. And one of the stories we told was the house had been moved twice. But in 1930, Margaret Evans Price, who was the wife, she was an artist, accomplished artist, designer of one of the designers of the earliest Fisher Price toys, and her husband Irving Price was the mayor in 1930, and he actually, just before Margaret Evans Price bought the Millard Fillmore house, which had been sitting vacant for years behind where today the Aurora Theater is, on Millard Fillmore Place. And she bought it and wanted to convert it into her artist studio. Well, this was literally a month before Fisher Price was started as a company, and so she um, bought the house. And the story goes that they put it on rollers and actually in two separate pieces, and rolled it down Main Street to the property where it is today on Shear Avenue, which they owned. Mrs. Price and Mr. Price owned this property on Shear Avenue, and because they were buying the house, not the land, they moved it down Main Street. Well, one of the stories that had been told for years was that Mr. Price, the mayor, Irving Price of East Aurora, was on the roof of the house as it rolled down Main Street, moving tree branches and electrical wires, phone wires out of the way as the house was making it down the street. And I thought, but nobody had a picture of this, and nobody had any primary source documentation of it. It was just a great story. So I'm like, well, I'm going to get to the bottom of this. So I looked at articles at the time in the Easter Advertiser and the Buffalo newspapers. Were very intrigued by the fact that Mrs. Price was buying this house, which is now a National Historic Landmark, for her art studio. And so I was combing through the articles to see, is there any mention of the mayor or photograph of the mayor on the roof of the house as it made its way down Main Street. And at best, I was thinking that I would not find any proof that he was on the roof. But what I did find was probably 90% proof that he wasn't on the roof, because they took the trouble in the article in the Easter Advertiser to note that two crewmen from the electric company, I believe it was the electric company, but workers were on the roof of the houses, the two pieces of the house that came down the street, to make sure that it wasn't hitting any wires or tree limbs, but mostly wires. They were concerned about the electrical wires across the street. And I thought, well, if they're mentioning that those gentlemen are on the top of the roof, and if Mr. Price was on the top of the roof, they most certainly would have mentioned that. So the fact that they mentioned two people that were on the roof, but not Mr. Price, lends the idea that this story was a myth. And I think what ended up happening is that people remembering the moving of the house, and it would have drawn quite a bit of attention, I would imagine, as it rolled down Main Street, watching, saw the men on the roof, and somehow that story got twisted into Mr. Price was on the roof. So that is how that story. And so now they, I believe, still tell that story at the house when you take a tour there, but with the caveat that it was part of local lore, and it was disproven, but it had become part of the story of the house, that Irving Price was on the roof, when in fact he was not on the roof. So if you hear that story, take that with a grain of salt, because it's not. We're pretty positive that the mayor of East Aurora was not riding on top of a house in 1930. Another story that has that's sort of it's sort of a technicality, but it's a very important technicality. Is a lot of you have probably heard about Mambrino King, the champion horse. There's a coffee shop in East Aurora named after this horse, and it was a purchase. Mr. Cicero Hamlin purchased Mambrino King, and it was dubbed by a French magazine. That's what got its fame for this horse, was the handsomest horse in the world. And Mambrino King was quite a good, gorgeous horse, and very tall horse, and garnered a great deal of attention. But a lot of times you'll see in history books or stories about Mambrino King, people will call him a champion racehorse. Well, that's not exactly true. He never raced, at least when he was at the Hamlin farm, he didn't. He was a stud. He was bred, and he produced champion racehorses, who the line of these racehorses still go on to today. And a lot of the children of Mambrino King were breaking records and on the circuit, and they became world famous for their speed. But Mambrino King was just not but he was the sire of these horses. So he wasn't racing himself. So when you say champion racehorse, he didn't win any championships, as far as I know, at least when he was at the Hamlin farm. And he did grow old. I believe he was 10 years old when Mr. Hamlin bought him. And in the time that Mr. Hamlin had him, that horse was really famous and really profitable. Profitable from not the racehorse part of it, but from the breeding part of it. And people would pay big money to come to East Aurora and have their horse breed. He would breed the horse with other horses and produce these champions. And people from around the world were coming to East Aurora to see this horse. And so they would come to East Aurora and come to the Hamlin Farm, which was where Hamlin Avenue and North Willow Street are today. And they would want to come see the horse. But when you see that Mambrino King is described as a racehorse, he really wasn't a racehorse. He was the producer of these world famous trotters and these fast horses. So that's something that's just sort of a technicality, but it's a really important technicality. And how that the probably the most famous horse for racing in East Aurora was not racing himself. So that's quite interesting. Speaking of Hamlin, this one was put out on the internet. This historical myth, and it seemed to be from somebody who wasn't from East Aurora, so didn't really know the dynamics or the map of East Aurora very well. But it got repeated, and then somebody came to me once with a question about it or an assumption about this, and I thought, oh, this is bigger than just one person posting it on the internet. And Hamlin Park, which is on the south side of East Aurora, the village, some folks had put out there that that's where Mr. Hamlin had his world famous horse farm. It's not. Actually, Hamlin Park, Mr. Hamlin owned Hamlin Park for probably, a day. And what ended up happening is the village wanted this park. It had been called Holmes Grove for years, and it had been privately held for years, including by a development company, a housing developer who had purchased all the land around it and built many of the houses that are now around Hamlin Park. And people had enjoyed this grove, and then later they had a baseball diamond beginning in about 1893, right where the baseball diamond is today. Well, at the turn of the century, there was some concern, 1899, there was some concern that this property was being sold, and the village didn't want to lose it. So the village put it up for public vote and actually borrowed money in order to purchase Hamlin, was Holmes Grove, the grove part of it, and the baseball diamond. Mr. Hamlin got wind of this, and he had been looking for some way to thank East Aurora for the years of helping him and putting up with, essentially, the crowds that were coming to his farm. And so he bought Hamlin Park from underneath the village. And so then presented it to the village. So Hamlin Park, and then the village named it after Mr. Hamlin in gratitude. But Hamlin Park had nothing to do with Mr. Hamlin's farm, which was on the north side of town, which is over by Hamlin Avenue and North Willow Street. That whole area was the farm. And someone had actually on the internet superimposed where the track would have been over Hamlin Park, the racing track, the horse racing track, as if that was Hamlin's farm. And in fact, the track, and they were guessing where that track would have been. And but in fact, the tracks were up on his farm on North Willow Street and Hamlin Avenue. And of course, housing developers came along after that and bought the land after the Hamlin farm was gone. And we don't need to guess. We know exactly where those racetracks were because we have old insurance maps that show right where they are and where all the structures were. So we don't have to guess. But one of the historical myths that have come out of just an internet post is that the Hamlin farm became Hamlin Park after the farm went under. Or actually, Mr. Hamlin, it was very successful. He just retired and sold his horses. And so when he dissolved the farm, he retired and it became a housing development. but the myth had been that his farm was at Hamlin Park, and after the farm left, that the farmland and where the racetrack was and everything became Hamlin Park. And one of the reasons this may have become a story is because this all happened around the same time. Mr. Hamlin was about to retire, and so over the course of just a few years, the farm, he retired and sold off the farm, and then he had donated Hamlin Park to the village. So all this was happening at the same time. So that idea might have come into people's heads, but Hamlin Park is totally separate from the Hamlin Farm, which was up on where Hamlin Avenue is today. And other than the fact that Mr. Hamlin donated the land to the village, he had nothing to do with the land that is now Hamlin Park today. He just bought it for the good of the community, but he never owned it all but maybe a day or a couple days. So lastly, one of the last story I'll tell, and that's why I was trying to put a picture up, and I'll do that in the comments after we're done here, is there's this picture from 1896 that always intrigued me, and it's a group of people gathered out in front of the Globe Hotel, and it was labeled that it was a Democrat. You can see clearly there's a banner and it says Democratic headquarters, and it was a Democratic rally for the Democratic Party in late October of 1896. And labeled on this picture and repeated over and over again and printed a couple times was that this was a rally for Williams Jennings Bryan, who was the Democratic candidate for president that year. And that Williams Jennings Bryan was the man speaking in front of the Globe Hotel. And I was like, holy cow. The fact that a presidential candidate, a major party presidential candidate, Williams Jennings Bryan, was visiting East Aurora, that was a pretty big deal. So I wanted to learn more about it. And I just had some suspicion. I'm like, this doesn't make sense. Why would a major presidential candidate, now mind you, at the time, Buffalo was more prominent, New York State was more prominent on the presidential election circuit, but I thought, this just doesn't seem to add up that a major party presidential candidate would be in East Aurora a week before the election day. He would probably be somewhere else. Well, digging a little further, I looked into the our trusty East Aurora Advertiser archives that we have at the historian's office, and found out that it wasn't Williams Jennings Bryan standing in that picture. There was a poster, and you'll see when I post it, there's a poster of Williams Jennings Bryan, a picture of him in front of the Globe, and then there's a man speaking, and they do look alike. But what led to this was that the Prohibition Party, which was a third party at the time, was holding a rally down the street. And the presidential candidate for the Prohibition Party, which at the time was a minor third party, was coming to East Aurora. Probably brought here because of the influence of Albert Hubbard, who was big in the Prohibition movement. And he came on a train and he spoke down the road at the Opera House, I believe. Well, the Democrats in East Aurora, and that's back in the day when we had these big rallies for presidential elections and other things, the Democrats didn't want to be outdone, and they wanted to draw attention away from the Prohibition candidate, so they held a rally of their own in front of the Globe Hotel. So that's the picture is a rally, the counter rally to the Prohibition, the speech of the Prohibition candidate. So the fact that a presidential candidate was visiting somehow got melded in together. So one party's candidate, a third party candidate, somehow became the Democratic candidate visiting East Aurora. So that story got sort of, morphed together over the years, and then it ended up as a label. And then, of course, it didn't help that the picture looked a lot like Williams Jennings Bryan, the man speaking. So the East Aurora Advertiser, going back into that original documentation, proved that myth. Great story, though. So that's the thing I want to leave you with, is that some of these stories are great myths, but and can be disproven. But it's interesting to study the way that it became a story and part of the local history, and maybe and see how those mistakes and half truths came to be. So please, if you have any other stories that don't seem to that maybe have come up, or you kind of like, I don't know if this is true, feel free to let me know. I love doing this. I love looking up history to try to debunk old stories, or sometimes find out they're true. You know, if you would say to me that there was a mile-long covered racetrack in East Aurora at one point, if I didn't know better, I'd be like, oh, that doesn't sound right. Well, it's true. So sometimes these stories are true, and it's just as fun to find out that they are true than it is to debunk them. So, well, we're almost out of time. So again, thank you for watching. If you're not watching live, you watch later, that's great too. Let me know what you think. Give me some ideas. Again, share the video if you like it. Be sure to like the page, follow the page if you want to learn more. And again, a lot of people say, "Oh, I can't watch at 3 o'clock," and I don't think there's an understanding of that these are on here all the time. So feel free to watch it anytime. I'm not offended if you can't come on live. With that said, if you have a better time you want me to come on, I'm not married to 3 o'clock on Tuesday. It's helpful for my schedule, but if there's another time, just shoot me a message. I might think about that. What's the best time to come on live? And next week, I think I talk about the East Aurora Advertiser a lot, and every town that has a local newspaper, it's invaluable to the study of local history. And I wrote about this over the summer when the Advertiser was having its 150th anniversary, and we are blessed in East Aurora to have a strong community newspaper. And I got to thinking about this, and the role of newspapers in local history is, you've heard a lot this week about George Santos, the newly elected congressman from New York, downstate, Long Island, and how he basically has, made up all sorts of parts of his resume, and now people are upset that he got elected, and we didn't know about this ahead of time. And the New York Times is getting credit for exposing after his election all these lies that he told before his election about his biography, about where his money's coming from, things like that. But in fact, a local community newspaper, and this is just coming out this week, a local community newspaper, small newspaper, had revealed all this. They had done their own investigation before Election Day and published it, but they didn't get, for a variety of reasons, it didn't get picked up by bigger news outlets. So it just shows how important local newspapers are, not only into investigative journalism, but into history, and how, all the we can talk about this, but just like the calendar of events, things like that, and the study of history through newspapers. So that's an idea I'm thinking about for next time, unless something more interesting comes up. And I, of course, welcome your ideas. So send them along. Again, thank you for joining me, and we'll see you next time.